Hello, and welcome back to this damn fully dealistic crusade. I wanted to talk a little bit in detail about the novelization of Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. It's no secret that I'm a great fan of film novelizations, which I really feel is a lost art in terms of a film's marketing campaign. I've collected them, practically my whole life, and it's really a wonderful thing to dig into because quite frequently novelizations are based on earlier drafts of a script or scripts that were thrown out, and will frequently feature things that were removed or not included in a final cut or release version of a film. So you will usually get at least some bit of deleted material, in addition to if it's a really good novelization, the writer taking at least some creative license and having some leeway and being able to not just put their own spin on things, but actually being able to enliven and enrich a film. So I think there are really great novelizations that, even if they are just following the shooting script of a film and they don't have any additional material, if it's well written enough, the writer can put enough of themselves into the material to, again, enrich the overall experience. So there are some I've read many times over the years that don't really deviate from the films themselves, and then there are some that heavily, to say they heavily deviate doesn't even begin to describe it. So if I ever come across a novelization and it's admittedly cheap enough, I go ahead and pick it up and add it to my collection because, again, I find them fascinating. It's something that doesn't really exist anymore outside of the very rare instances where there is a novelization commissioned, or somehow there is some sort of book project tied to a film. So I quite some time ago, I picked up a used copy of the Prince of Thieves novelization, which was written by the British science fiction and fantasy author Simon Green, based on the screenplay for the film. And I had no idea going in if this was going to be much different, but I was at least hoping it would have the deleted subplot in the film about the real nature of the relationship between Mortiana the Witch and the Sheriff of Nottingham, which was put back in for the extended cut in the 2000s and the DVD era by Warner Brothers. This was a real bone of contention between the director Kevin Reynolds and the producers, wanting to keep that material in the film and the studio not wanting it at all, and eventually was part of what led to Reynolds being locked out of the editing process, Stuart Baird being brought in to be a new supervising editor, and essentially the theatrical version of the film was a studio-sanctioned release cut at clocking in at somewhere around 144 minutes, whereas the extended version adds back in this subplot and runs about an extra 10 to 15 minutes longer. However, there is evidence of further bits and pieces of materials that were shot and not included, and these are alluded to in some of the extras found on the new Arrow UHD release if you dig around the documentary and the legacy commentaries ported over. So it's not just the extended cut material that was removed. There are other little bits and pieces throughout that were removed. Nothing particularly major, but of course I don't have all the various script drafts to go over, and the film did go through a number of rewrites throughout the pre-production and actually during the production itself, it seems. So a number of changes were instated over time, and of course Alan Rickman famously, along with some friends of his, rewrote all of the Sheriff of Nottingham's dialogue and basically brought an entirely different approach, which made, of course, the sheriff the most memorable thing in the film and what everyone loves to quote to this day. First thing they think of when you say Prince of Thieves is, of course, Alan Rickman's performance, because it's the most energetic thing in the entire film. So when you come to the novelization, you expect to hopefully get some of the deleted materials, of course, to see what we got eventually in the extended cut of the film, and to see how the film translates in book form, and to see maybe what the differences might be. So I went in expecting maybe to see some of the deleted materials, but otherwise it follow the relative shooting script of the film and the same dialogue. And that is largely what you get. However, I noticed very quickly that some things were a little bit different. A lot of the dialogue and the situations are exactly the same. It is following, presumably, what is the shooting script of the film, so it won't seem alien to those who know the film or who are great fans of the film. But very quickly, I started to notice there were a lot of little additions and a lot of little subtle tweaks here and there throughout. And again, since I don't have the actual shooting script or the various drafts to look at, I can only guess and surmise what this may be. But it seems like what Green did in this novelization, and I've not read any of his other works, but they do seem very well regarded, and he's done a number of various fantasy series, for example. He seems to have been able to sort of polish off some of the rough edges in terms of how the film plays out. And that's something I've always had major issues with, because I think the film's biggest problem is its tonal inconsistencies. It's kind of all over the map in terms of tone, particularly in how the Sheriff of Nottingham is so full of life and over the top, and Robin Hood himself is internalized and very pensive as Kevin Costner plays him, which is sort of the antithesis of the traditional Robin Hood. And that's just, an example of the film's many tonal problems. Well, here, if you look very closely, even though it follows the events of the film almost entirely, there's a lot of little tweaks and a lot of little subtle changes in some of the actual flow of particular sequences, and also some of the dialogue is a bit tweaked here and there. And in the process of doing this is what a really good writer does with a film novelization. He or she is not just simply supposed to regurgitate what is on the shooting script page, which unfortunately is the bulk of most novelizations you come across. What Green is able to do here is really build upon each of the characters, and I think find certain highlights in each of them that are the things we like and identify with each of the characters. And so I do actually think he manages to make each character feel a little bit more lived in, and also really strengthen certain characters. So I think Robin Hood, in terms of how he comes across in the novelization versus the film, I think in a lot of ways that Green is able to give Robin of Locksley in the novelization a bit more of a feeling of backbone and strength. And also he comes across as being a bit more Robin Hoodish in feeling. There's a little bit more of the sparkle, that twinkle in the eye that I think every Robin Hood needs a degree of. He doesn't come across as fully internalized as what Kevin Costner's doing in the film. And that's not saying that Costner gives a bad performance, because I really like what he does, but it's just, it feels kind of awkward as having him as Robin Hood. He is not the sort of, I think the actor anybody would immediately think of when you say Robin Hood, because he's known for very internalized, pensive performances in his sort of screen persona, which is perfectly fine, and he's a fantastic actor. But again, I've just always had a sort of mental struggle every time I come back to Prince of Thieves, because you keep expecting, especially when he has to give the big rousing speeches and things, and you don't quite have that requisite internal heroic Robin Hood persona quality that you so associate when you just hear the name Robin Hood, of the bold and daring outlaw. It's not quite there because it's a different rendering in the film. So I think in the book, the single greatest strength it has compared to the film is that Robin of Locksley himself feels quite a bit more your, not necessarily traditional Robin Hood ideal, but he has a bit more determination that comes across, and again with a bit more humor coming into play, and there's just a sense of there's some more backbone there. It's a slight change, but I really appreciated that, and that matches what happens with the Sheriff of Nottingham, because here the sheriff is exactly the way he's written in the original script pages. You don't have any of the Alan Rickman intensity, and it's been described that his performance as maybe a little bit campy in places, and he's definitely going what would be considered over the top in terms of energy. There's a sort of inherent whimsy that he carries in the midst of kind of almost having a manic energy in places. Like he's an alien amongst a completely different. He's basically like an alien dropped on a planet, and he can't associate with anyone, and no one can get on his wavelength. So he's just continually frustrated, which is very amusing. Some of the lines are a little bit different. You basically, the things that will immediately jump out are, of course, the famous I'll carve your heart out, I'll tear your heart out with a spoon, is the original scripted, I'll tear your heart out for this Loxley. So, you don't have that. You still have the cancel Christmas line. It's a little, that whole exchange is worded a little bit differently, but cancel Christmas is still there. But it's a much more believable villain in terms of without having that wonderfully charming internal just sense of sardonic humor being played up so much. This, of course, obviously is immediately a much more it's a flatter, more direct sheriff because it's the character as originally written, the much more traditional type of villain. But the intensity of his villainy is still there. Everything he does is still exactly the same. But it's an interesting way to look at the film if you removed Alan Rickman's performance from the equation and you had the character as written. But that makes a nice contrast with Robin himself having a bit more backbone and a bit more humor. And so you have a more traditional Robin Hood versus villain type scenario like you have in, your more traditional adaptations in terms of films, and of course going all the way back to the original tales of Robin Hood and the Merry Men of Sherwood Forest. So that was a nice change in order of seeing what was more the original concept, I suppose you could say, of the original script. But then peppered throughout, we have other slightly expanded upon moments with the other characters. It's everything that happens in the film, but some of the sequences are because in the world of literature you can expand time, and you can with a simple extra paragraph here and there, and you can really savor the moment a bit more, which you can't do in a film in the same way with the same sort of ease. So that's another reason why novelizations can frequently really enhance your appreciation of a film, even if it's just telling the same exact story and sequence by sequence. I do think for the most part you are following the film as is, but we start to have a lot of little tiny pieces, which I can only assume is part of the extra material that was not included in either released version of the film. We do have the entire Mortiana subplot with the Sheriff of Nottingham explaining the origins of the sheriff that was finally instated into the extended cut of the film. So back in 91, if you picked up the novelization, you were already getting that material. So that was apparently cut relatively late in the game. And again, the director was removed from the editing process, which is never something that should occur. So I don't even think you could call the extended cut a director's cut. It's just the restoration of an entire subplot. But there are other little tiny pieces scattered throughout that, again, seem to be other deleted materials. The character of Will Scarlet, who's played by Christian Slater in the film, comes across a little bit better in the novel as well. He seems a little bit more well-rounded, as all the characters do, because you have a little bit more time with them in terms of there's some extra description in the text and extra paragraphs here and there to flesh out individual moments and scenes. But there's one particular moment that was something apparently shot and removed for the film that is alluded to by Christian Slater in the commentary that he's a part of, that during the sort of celebration in Sherwood Forest when Robin and Marian are going around at night before the birthing scene where Azim winds up doing a sort of C-section, where when Will Scarlet comes up and he's trying to charm Marian, that he actually has a little song, as you would expect in a Robin Hood film that there would be a song somewhere, because most of them have songs telling the tales of Robin. But he has a song, and it's as practically everything Scarlet does in the films story, it's actually, a very obvious underhanded, strike at Robin himself, because the Will Scarlet character in this rendering is carrying some unspoken grudge that we don't become fully aware of what that is until the end of the film, or the final act, I should say. So we spend the whole time wondering why he has this beef with Robin, and so there's this extra scene where he actually sings a seemingly traditional song, but all the words are clearly designed to be a slap in the face to Robin, to provoke some sort of reaction, because, again, Will Scarlet is carrying an axe to grind for some reason. So that's one particular scene that I know for sure was something shot and removed from the film that is in the novelization. It's little small pieces like that for the most part, and there's not a whole lot of them, but there's enough that I think you can recognize when it's like all of a sudden, oh, well, I know the film pretty well, and then okay, now we're on to something that probably is part of the additional materials that were removed that we have not seen in terms of either cut of the film. Another interesting thing is when the sheriff allies himself with the Celts in the film as part of his sort of hired army. The head of this group, who is played by the iconic Pat Roach in the film, he sticks around for quite a bit longer in the novelization, and in fact is part of the finale, where we have the setup of all of the men of Sherwood are going to be hung, and Robin Hood and his remaining band put into motion their rescue attempt. Well, there's a whole additional part of that sequence where the leader of the Celts is in the midst of the fireworks going on, essentially, and gets his comeuppance and everything. So there's a whole additional development in the finale. I can only assume that was perhaps shot as well, because it is rather well developed in the novelization, but that's not in the film. Basically, everything you have in the extended cut is in the novelization, plus a few other additional little pieces that are interesting. You'll notice this right from the start when we have the death of Robin's father, which happens in the very beginning of the film. That actually is slightly different in the staging, because we have the whole group led by the sheriff who wind up killing Robin's father. But the staging is a bit different because Morgiana is there, and she starts doing some of her black magic rituals there. And we also get quite a bit more of the interplay between her and the sheriff right from the get-go, which again is not in the film at all. So right there, the staging is a bit different. There's also a little bit more business in the opening sort of Crusades prologue, where Robin first meets Azim, and they sort of rescue each other, because by freeing Azim is able to lead them out of the prison they've been stuck in all this time. The sequence is extended by some bits where they're going through various tunnels and things, and Azim is leading them through, and they're being chased by guards and shot at with crossbows, and they're dealing with the rats and the sort of sewers and things. We get basically the very tail end of that in the film. We cut to they're going right out of the prison to the tail end of that when they're climbing up the ladder out into the street. Well, there's a little bit more business that happens that was scripted and shot. It's alluded to in the Kevin Reynolds and Kevin Costner commentary that there's a little bit more they shot there that was removed. And then you have that in the novelization too. So there's certain pieces in the novelization that we know were shot and not included anywhere, and then some other little pieces that may have been shot, may have been part of the shooting script, or they may have been invented by the author, but I think they were probably also little pieces that were deleted. I think what Green brings to this in terms of his specific contributions, and again, this is all pure guesswork, I think his contributions are more in the actual rendering of individual scenes and sort of strengthening some of the character motivations a little bit. And there is overall, I think the greatest thing the novelization does is there is much more consistency of tone throughout. I was really pleasantly surprised by how well the tone was maintained throughout, even though it is telling the same story as the film. So I wouldn't go into this, thinking, oh, this is all the stuff that was deleted from the film. It's possible. I'm sure there might even be a little bit more, because there was quite a bit of footage not included in any version. And whenever you have, the director getting locked out of editing and just having to just wash his hands of the whole thing, you're going to run into some degree of that. But I think the greatest improvement is that the tone is much more consistent. I think it's really rewarding having Robin's character be a bit more. He just feels much more involved throughout, and you get more of that inherent humor and energy you need in a Robin Hood. There needs to be some bit of forcefulness, and to balance that, you don't have the wonderfully over-the-top Alan Rickman additions to the Sheriff of Nottingham, because if you still had that, I don't know how it would translate into the written word. I don't know if it would exactly translate into the novel form without having to completely rewrite the character from scratch, because you're still having to adhere to the film story itself. So it's a very hard thing to do for any writer coming into novelizations. Not everyone can do it, and there are some who really developed a knack for it, and that's why those are the names you want to look for in terms of novelizations and see all the different ones they wrote. But this was a real surprise. I really enjoyed it. And to be honest, because the tone is so much more consistent, and I really like a lot of the little tweaks that Green seems to have made to a lot of the not just the story overall, but in a lot of individual scenes, even some of the dialogue, when he makes some tweaks to the actual written word. And again, this may go back to how the original scripts were before the actors and director tweaked things, or various drafts came later. It just seems to flow quite better throughout. Not in some of the dialogue, some of the sequences flow a little bit better. You have some additional material which helps the story flow a bit more, and you have character motivations made a bit more obvious. This is all the stuff that you want in a novelization. This is all the stuff that you expect in a good film novelization. Even if it can't deviate a whole lot from the film story, you read the novelization because you want to immerse yourself more in the world of the film. And of course, especially back in the days before home video, this was really the only way you could revisit a film, unless you got to see a repertory screening, or it stayed in your local theater for a very long time, or came on television a couple years later. Your choices were a lot more limited, which is of course why now film novelizations are a thing of the past, which is really unfortunate, because when done well, as you have here, they're enormously fun and build upon the film itself. So to be quite honest, I actually think the novelization is better than the film, because it's so much more consistent. It's the same story, but you have some really nice additional materials that I wish were in the film. This is one of those films that, even though it's already long, and then the extended cut made it longer, if it's already going to be that long, you really need to have that additional material as well, because I think when complete in its complete form, it would probably play a little bit better and not feel as long. It's the old adage of a terrible 90-minute movie feels like it's 3 hours long, but a well-made 3-hour movie feels like it's 90 minutes long, because you don't feel the passage of time. But again, when things don't work and things are bad, or that's how a short movie can feel really long, because you feel every minute of the passage of time. This was a real surprise, because I expected some of the deleted material, and I was hoping the extended cut subplot would be here, which it is, but I wasn't expecting how much better some of the characters feel defined. And it was, again, really interesting to see the sheriff here without the wonderful over-the-top Alan Rickman performance there. So he's basically a much more straight arrow character in the book, and that's how he was originally written in the various screenplays. So it's a real fascinating novelization. So if you do come across it, or if you're a big fan of the film, I do very much recommend it. You will have to find, of course, an affordable used copy. I don't think this has ever been reprinted like most novelizations, but it's also a very quick read because you just have your traditional standard paperback. This was done by Berkeley as a movie tie-in, so it's in your traditional design. By this point in the early 90s, these were pretty much down to an exact science. It's not very long. It clocks in at only 234 pages, and because the tone feels so much more consistent and it's a very quick read, I think that also helps in it feeling like it just plays better than what you get in the film. You could ostensibly sit down and read this and enjoy it, and it takes less time to read this than the actual film takes to watch, particularly in the extended cut being a little longer. So you can get this and read it very quickly. It's well written, and I just think it plays better overall than the film. I was very pleasantly surprised. Plus, you do get additional deleted subplots and little tiny scenes that were apparently part of the original shooting script of the film. So I know at least some of the bits you have here in the novelization were actually shot and are just not in either cut of the film. Other pieces may have just been dropped or not shot. I'm not sure, but it seems like they would have, because none of them are very large, but they all seem to add to the film in terms of its story. The one thing I will say the novelization does do that is handled better in the film is, again, in the sort of night celebration at Sherwood after the birthing scene, where Azim performs a sort of C-section and saves both the lives of mother and child. And so little John gets to walk out and say, "Here's my child." When Friar Tuck comes over and it does the whole "Come, I have been wrong. Come enjoy the Lord's brew with me," and Azim, being Moorish, is unable to due to his faith and religion. It's a nicely handled scene, and it's a great payoff to those two characters and the scenes that led up to that. Here in the novel, you have the same setup, but when Azim protests that his faith does not allow him to partake in alcohol, in the film he remains adamant, and they sort of go off, and Friar Tuck says, you can just talk while I drink. Here in the book, it's sort of left a bit more ambiguous, like Azim's going to just throw away his convictions for a while and get hammered with Friar Tuck. It's a little open-ended. You could read it either way, but it seems to indicate that, and it's kind of like, well, that kind of doesn't make sense with his character, but okay, that's a very minor quibble. That's the only thing I noticed that's handled a bit better in the film in terms of character motivation, in terms of things like that. It's a very minor thing, but I did find it interesting how that was handled here. And again, that might have been in just the script draft that Green was given to write the novelization and base off of. I don't know, because I don't have all the various script drafts, which would be fascinating to read if those are floating around somewhere. But in any case, this is just a fun little read, and if you can find a copy, they're not very expensive. But of course, I say that, and when you if you go online or you go on eBay and you're trying to find a particular movie tie-in novelization that's, of course, long out of print, then of course all you find are copies in terrible condition, and all of a sudden you got to pay $10, $15, $20 or more just because you're trying to find a specific novelization. But if you were patient and you dug around used bookshops, you'd eventually find it for $1 or $2. And this was mixed in our local bookstore's bargain section. So if I see a movie novelization in a bargain section, and it's less than $1 or 50 cents, or I think this one might have been in the section of books for a quarter, actually. So that's why this is a little worn, but it's still in solid shape, and it was amusing. It's always fun finding odd things in books, or interesting things, or where the previous owner wrote their name, so you get that sense of somebody read this before you, and passage of time, and it's a fun aspect of buying used books. But occasionally you find an example of something it's so weird and bizarre. It goes on that list of strange things I've found in used books. And this one, I opened it finally to see that the previous owner not only wrote her name, but apparently she was a great fan of the film and the book because, as you can see, the lipstick stain apparently felt the need that she had to kiss the title page. So that was interesting. Apparently, Sherry really loved this book and this film, or Kevin Costner, I guess, maybe, I don't know, but yeah, that was just rather amusing. So I wanted to highlight that. Again, this is a fun little read, and I love novelization so much that when I find a good one, I want to talk about it. And you don't have the opportunities to talk about paperback tie-in novelizations of films from the 90s in your everyday life, unfortunately. It'd be great if you could, but you say movie novelization to most people, and they just don't know what language you're speaking. So that's why I wanted to do a video on this, because I did really think not only was this very enjoyable, it was better than I thought it was going to be, but I think it does add quite a lot to the experience of the film. And revisiting that on the Arrow UHD and doing a review and everything, I felt I had to at least talk about the novelization some. So if you've never read this and you love the film, this is a must read. If you like movie novelizations, this is a really great one. It does have enough deleted materials and other things to make it, I think, a rewarding read. But if you like to study not just the art of screenwriting, but story construction, character development, and things, because this has a number of really subtle changes for quite a lot of the characters, and a lot of subtle changes and tweaks to the dialogue and some of the sequences and things, plus the addition of all the deleted materials, I think this is rewarding to look at from a story and character construction perspective as well. And I really think Simon Green did a nice job with this, considering I'm sure there were probably extreme constraints, as most movie novelizations back in the day had. You could only do so much. You usually couldn't change a whole lot. You're working from older drafts, and things have to be out and finished by a certain point, usually long before the movie actually finishes shooting, so that way it's tied into the marketing machine, because usually these were coming out significantly ahead of a film's release date, so they could actually be in bookstores by the time the film was out and in general release. So if you've actually read this, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I love getting to talk about movie novelizations. Again, I've done videos on some of my own collection of various novelizations I've picked up over the years. Anytime I get the chance to read one for a film that I'm really interested in, like Prince of Thieves, I love getting the chance to do so. And this was one of those nice surprises where it's not only well written, it not only has deleted materials, but I think it really does build upon the film. And because the tone is more consistent here, I think it plays better. So I would love to hear your thoughts if you've read this or you've ever come across this before. And if you happen to find a copy, or if you love the film, definitely check this out. It is very much worth your time. As a final note, I would also like to say it is exceptionally difficult to read this and not have the Bryan Adams song, "Everything I Do It For You," stuck in your head the whole time, because that's what happened to me. Not only is that song an undying earworm because it just gets stuck in your head, and sold so many copies, it was ridiculously successful. When you read this, and if you even think of the song at some point, which you will, because you do every time somebody mentions the film, the song starts playing in your head. It will be playing in the background of your mind while you're reading this. So I constantly, I'm reading this and thinking about the film as I'm reading, and I'm like, oh, this is a cool deleted bit, and oh, look at this interesting little thing here, and then songs in my head again, and I'm like, okay. And then I get a chapter later, and then songs back in my head. So it made the book even more amusing, because the whole time I'm reading, I hear Bryan Adams in my head. So that was fun. I should have known that was going to happen, because that song it seems to live rent free in your head once you hear it. But in any case, I hope this has been at least somewhat fun and informative to hear me once again babble on about not just films, but the whole world of film novelizations, which I'm still fascinated by and adore, and wish would come back in at least some form outside of just random sort of offshoots where there's a novelization every once in a blue moon. But in any case, I really enjoyed the heck out of this. Very highly recommended. And as always, I like to say, keep supporting local independent bookstores by buying print books, keep reading print books, keep supporting local stores by searching for film novelizations if you are as big of a fan of them as I am. And thank you ever so much for watching.